Welcome to this webinar. Along with the tourism industry, cultural and creative sectors are among the most affected by the current coronavirus crisis. In these unprecedented times, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is joining forces with its partners to try to understand the impact on our sectors and how policies, cities and regions, but also national governments can support these sectors. We organize a series of talks in April, starting today with the talk on museums, and then next Friday we'll look into creative and cultural sectors more broadly. And at the end of the month, we offer a training opportunity for policymakers and practitioners through our digital academy for cultural and creative industries. Together with Peter Keller, Director General of ICOM, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers, and you will see them live in a moment. We have Mattia Agnetti, who joins us from Venice, where he is the Executive Secretary of the Foundation of Venice City Museums. We have Nathalie Bondil with us, who is the Director General and Chief Curator of the Montreal Fine Arts Museum. We have Kyung Chang, who is joining from Korea, where she is the Founding Director of the Iron Museum. We have John Davis, Economic Research Fellow in Nesta and in the Creative Industries Policy Evidence Centre in the UK. We have also Commission with us, the European Commission. Maciej Hoffman is a policy officer in the European Commission, Director General for Education and Culture. And Antonio Lampis is Director General of Museums in the Italian Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And we also have Joan Roca, who is the Director of MUHBA, Barcelona History Museum in Spain. With this, Peter, I would like to invite you to welcome our participants and also to open the webinar.
Thank you very much, Katja, for the introduction. Allow me a few words on the situation of museums worldwide. The pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns severely affect the cultural and creative sectors and affect museums. According to a survey ICOM launched, almost all museums around the world are closed. Maybe 5% are still open. The financial impact of the lockdowns and the closures will depend on the ownership, the funding, and the size of the museum. According to a survey by NEMO in Europe, big museums and museums in touristic areas report 75 or 80% loss of income. The bigger the percentage of income from ticket and retail, the more immediate and more immense the impact. Museums which are mainly publicly funded won't see the impact immediately, and not for professionals but later. However, freelance museum professionals are right now losing income, for example, in conservation in France or in education in Germany. And there we are speaking about 7,000 professionals. Museums are already adapting to the situation. During the closure, many of them are focusing on online activities, and to websites, visits to museum websites have risen by up to 500%. ICOM, as the International Council of Museums, is working in 3 directions to support professional museums: monitoring the sector, publishing recommendations and best practice examples with the help of experts in our network. And we also published a statement last week to urge policy and decision makers to rapidly allocate relief funds to ensure sustainability of museums. We will develop advocacy tools for museums and for ICOM's national committees to highlight the important role museums play in the local economy and sustainable development, as well as in community well-being and resilience. And the guide on local development OECD and ICOM published last year, and I think you will present it, Katja, is an important instrument as well. The pandemic and the lockdowns present manifold challenges. According to our survey, a large majority, 9 out of 10 respondents, expect museums programs to be reduced. 1 out of 4 expect staff to be reduced, and almost 1 out of 10 expect their museums to be closed permanently. Now, more than ever, we need innovative strategies and concrete policy actions. We are aware that this is not a simple matter of keeping our institutions alive, but also mobilize their efforts and capacities to change. Museums are already responding to the situation, and it's fascinating to see the diverse and innovative creative solutions they put in place. I'm confident that museums will cope with this situation as they have done before. Thank you once again to OECD for hosting this webinar, and thank you to all those who are joining us from around the world for your interest. A warm welcome on behalf of ICOM to our speakers. We all look forward to your reflections and contributions. I'm sure what we will be discussing today will also resonate to those working in other areas in cultural and creative sectors, perhaps even beyond. Thank you all.
Thank you, Peter. Last year in Kyoto, together with ICOM, we launched the OECD ICOM Guide for Local Governments, Communities and Museums. And this guide highlights the role of museums as agents of local economic and social change. Indeed, museums create jobs, they bring revenues, they are anchor institutions for many communities. Across the world, they're at the heart of many urban regeneration projects. They can contribute to community development. They also contribute to people's well-being and support inclusion by working with many other partners like schools, prisons, hospitals, job centers. And all these areas are, of course, very important for local development and will be even more so in the post-crisis recovery. So it is in this broader perspective, local development perspective, that we would like to place our debate today. Our discussion will focus on three issues. First of all, we would like, with our panel speakers, to understand better what are the impacts on museums of the current crisis. Then we would like to look into these new things that are developing, innovations and opportunities, and game changers that we would like to bring with us into the post-crisis times. And of course, we would like to discuss the policies that should be put in place to support the museum sector. If we look at a little bit at the impacts that the current crisis has on museums, of course, museums across the world, both public and private, see their revenues drop, and which puts their financial sustainability at risk. The American Alliance of Museums estimates that up to 30% of American museums, and mostly in small and rural areas, will not reopen if there is no immediate financial assistance. In addition to earnings in addition to losses in earned revenues, museums are expecting also a drop and a decrease in charitable contributions and donations. And we need to understand that even in optimistic scenarios, time will be needed to get to the pre-crisis levels of international and domestic tourism. And this means that in the medium-term perspective, museums might have much less resources even for their core functions. And of course, these reduced revenues impact on jobs in the museums, but also around the museums. We see around the world that museums have to reduce wages, lay off staff, especially temporary staff, external contracts. And more than that, there is a structural threat to the survival of companies and freelancers who don't work in the museums. They work outside of the museums, but they are really vital for the work of the museums. And of course, we see that most of the local development projects in which museums participate are now put on hold. And in the future, museums will have much less capacity and resources to participate in this project. But let's try to also look into the bright side of the picture. The context is, of course, unprecedented, but so is the vitality of museums. We cannot go to museums, but museums come to us. And we can see all these different museum and chill, Culture Chez Nous, and all sorts of other digital platforms that are emerging. And as you said, Peter, the digital offer is very much in demand today. For example, in Louvre, I think they see that if before the crisis they had 40,000 visitors per day of their website, now it's 400 per day, 400,000 per day. So what does it mean really? What is happening? I think we see really an increased recognition of the role of culture plays for our societies and for people's well-being and mental health. We see this increased attention and recognition of the link between culture and education. And I give a special sign to those of us who are homeschooling today and really benefit from this link between schools and museums, where they continue to join forces and provide very interesting educational contents to us parents. And of course, there is an increased level of trust in cultural institutions that can be capitalized also in the post-crisis times and the recovery. And obviously, digital becomes very, very important. So what do we need to support this, the museum sector and the museum ecosystem, the people and firms that are around the museums? We see that across the countries, governments and cities are putting in place different support measures. And of course, the support measures should help the museums, but also, as I was saying, the ecosystem around them. And we're talking about emergency financial assistance, tax and rent reliefs, both for public and private museums, income support measures, access to business support programs, and tax incentives for donations and charities. And while we all wait to be able, hopefully rather soon than late, rejoin this queue, and this is a queue for the Pompidou Center in Paris, let's now turn to our panel members to hear their views on these three issues. So our first question is a question about the impact of the current crisis on museums and their communities and their ecosystem. I would like now to turn to Nathalie Bondil from Montréal, MUHBA, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Nathalie, can you share with us your perspective on what's happening?
Thank you, Ekaterina. Thank you, everybody, for this great initiative. In fact, I would like to enhance today the very different and various situations among museums, because of course, now as I am exchanging a lot with my colleagues from public museums, for example, in France or in Ottawa, where the staff is protected by an administrative statute, it is very, very different what we are living right now through this crisis. Of course, for private museums, I mean in Canada, like the Glenbow or the other museums in United States, sometimes they had to do some very, very drastic decision, like 80% of layoff with their staff. For us, as like the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, we are a private museum, but we do receive a grant from our province government, so provincial government. So we're really facing, like many little enterprises, huge challenges with liquidities, with the cash flow. So it is an unprecedented situation, because now we have to make rather difficult decision, or to be very creative in terms saying, oh, we keep our staff, but for some board members, they do not want to keep people who are not able to work 100% time, and they can't do some teleworking, or we have to be more creative. So in region, for a much smaller museum, I even discussed with some directors who are alone. They do not have anybody with them. So I think that it is very important now just to understand the variety of our situations, and which explain the variety of what we are doing and of our decisions.
Yes, thank you very much, Nathalie. And of course, the contexts are different across the globe, and for public and private museums, and for small and large ones. But even for public museums, one could think that they benefit from public supports, but in many countries, up to 40% or even more of their revenues come from tickets or other commercial activities. And in many other countries, they also have to pay huge they have to pay, for example, for their rent, which can be also a big chunk of their revenues as well. So even for stable public museums, the situation is not easy at all.
And if I can just add one point, is, as you said, what is important is not just for the museum, but for the whole ecosystem, because we need also to support the ecosystem. And I'm thinking about the artist position, which is rather difficult right now. And so we really have to be creative, but we have some solutions.
Very good, and I'm eager to hear more on the solutions later during this webinar. Matti Agnetti, Executive Secretary of the Foundation of the Venice City Museums. Now I would like to turn to you, and of course I cannot not remind ourselves of the title of the last year's Venice Biennale, May One Live in Challenging Times. But
yeah. Yes, very much indeed, Caterina. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And by the way, this is the second big challenge we are facing after the Acqua Alta last November. So it's one after the other. But coming back to your question, as Nathalie said, I think there might be different situations when it comes to the management of the museums, whether they are publicly owned or they are private institutions. To this regard, they definitely share the shortage in terms of revenues, no doubt, because even public institutions, with few exceptions in some countries, nevertheless benefit of the ticketing, for instance. And of course, this total lockdown it impacts not only now, but even the months ahead, and will definitely impact at least for 1 year time, I think. I personally think we will only start again to operate on a normal basis just in, let's say, in 10 to 12 months time. As I said, there are many differences. Nathalie mentioned the status of the workers, the employees, those, let's say, being supported directly by the public, and those instead who are right now facing, which is our case, for instance, a stop in their contract. Right now we are like a car who was used to drive very fast, and now we're driving very slow. We try to keep the engine alive nevertheless, and so there are still the basic functions. I think what impacted immediately, what I noticed, it's that what before was just a complementary offer in terms of cultural and scientific offer, meaning the digital offer, it's now became suddenly the only unique offer we as museums are able to deliver. This is an element to think about. Another issue which I think, especially in the medium term, I think it's good to consider is that the potential restraint of scientific and cultural projects which the museums, both public and private, will be able to deliver. And that will be primarily due to the, let's say, to the decreased resources available. No doubts about it, because even if in some countries, European countries, such as Italy, for instance, there's a current debate on it, thinking about additional funds for culture as an engine for a future relaunch of our societies. Nevertheless, my opinion is that at the very beginning, there will be a lack of resources. And so the museums will have to be able to find in themselves, let's say, the resources to provide the cultural offer. And this will have to be complemented, to my opinion, with a necessary international cooperation between institutions, which is, of course, right now available. It's now implemented, but it will become more and more common. And I personally think this will benefit not only the cultural project itself, but the whole staff and people involved in the museums, also in terms of exchanges of know-how and capacities, like training between people involved in the museums. I mean, Caterina, there are many things we could discuss and point out, but unfortunately, I think we have only a few minutes each. Maybe I can come back later. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. And of course, well, maybe I take a few points that indeed the recovery will take long, most likely. We can't expect it to come back like in a couple of weeks, but as you say, maybe 10, 12 months are needed. And you're right to point out to the impact on the scientific and cultural projects in the medium and maybe longer term as well. And as you say, digital is now the only solution, but how sustainable that is, I wonder, and should pay for access be introduced at some stage if the lockdown continues? But if yes, then how we really can include those who don't have the resources or whose resources are being reduced now in the current context. And I think you are absolutely right that maybe on the bright side of things, there will be more international and national cooperation. And we saw that after the 2008 crisis, when many museums had to pool their resources together, the back office, and that's really led to quite a number of innovations. So thank you so much, Mattia. And now I would like to turn to Joan Roca from Barcelona, please.
The first thing to say is that, yes, as Natalie said, the impact of the crisis clearly differs from one type of museum to another. From the museums that depend entirely on their income from ticketing, where the downfall has been immediate, to the museums that mostly depend on the public budget and have been able to lessen the blow. That's true, but in all cases, museums are not alone. Museums are just the tip of an iceberg, of a complex cultural, social, and economic system, such as those concerning literature, or theater, or cinema, with very diverse professionals and companies working in it. And it's important to say that because decision makers many times don't know that. They talk about museums. No, museums are the top of a very big cultural ecosystem in which you can find very, very different kinds of jobs which do different tasks. Most of them have been in outsourcing in the last years. And for example, for conservation and restoration of collections, research to produce knowledge and to share it in lectures and seminars, production of exhibitions, audiovisuals, books, apps, public programs and activities, participatory social projects, education, visits, urban tours, maintenance and attention to the public. It's a very complex cultural ecosystem that is now endangered. In the short term, so it's very different if you can cope with the situation, as was in our case, because the authorities help you to say, oh, don't go too far, try to keep everybody paid and try not to have somebody fired. But as a whole, a lot of workers are being laid off, at least temporarily. That's a big drama because it's a very extremely fragile professional network that can be lost because it suffered already a lot in the financial crisis of 2008 and so on. So most companies were already recovering and now have the problem. So, well, so to say, after all, museums are just the big top of an ecosystem that could be in a disaster if we don't react in mid-term and long-term, carrying the fact that we could be phagocytated by a few big companies. The risk of dissolving this rich ecosystem and seeing how a few companies take care of it, it's very dangerous. So we would need a reconstruction policy, a Marshall Plan for museums to enhance a sector with a high cultural, social, and economical productivity. And here, the role of municipalities can be really strategic to redirect the potential of museums in the future. Of course, I'm not talking about doing the same done before. And that's important because museums were already in a process of big change. So the crisis can also be an opportunity to innovate, but that's next question, I think.
Yes, Joan, thank you so much also for highlighting this, as you say, iceberg or ecosystem dimension. So the impact is really much broader than just on the museums. And as you also mentioned, well, probably a lot of museums, they underwent these different degrees of outsourcing in the past years. And maybe that's also one of the, well, reasons for the current situation where we have to also look very attentively into this ecosystem which is vital for the museum's work. And I also see some reactions from our participants that they say, yes, indeed, bravo, that's the outsourcing thing that maybe we should look into in the future. Now I would like to turn to Inkung Chang from Korea. If you could also share with us your perspective on what's happening, what is the impact that you see on museums and maybe their wider networks.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you. After the official closing of national museums in Korea on February 25th, the Korean Museum Association took a quick survey on the damaged status of the private museums and art galleries for 1 month period time in February. 122 museums replied, and it was reported that they already had a severe decrease in income, along with partners, artists, hospitality service providers, and exhibit developers, and many more. Between the 122 museums, the estimated immediate income loss for a month was more than $1 million, even though at the time, 40% of the museums are still operating. Unlike national museums, small private museums are facing uncertainty to maintain their facilities and staff for a prolonged period without a steady income. As mentioned, Natalie and Mattia and Joan already mentioned about this, ticket sales and so forth. The employees are forced to work at homes and salaries are cut or asked to take an unpaid vacation due to the lack of cash flow. The long-term effects of this pandemic crisis on museums are hard to predict concretely, yet it is inevitable that this crisis has altered the social ecology profoundly, and the economic downturn is inescapable. It shows how vulnerable a museum is to be in this state of emergency, even for a short time. Social distancing for health and safety precautions changed social behavior and also affected traditional mode of communication and delivery of museum contents. While more prominent and affluent museums equipped with digital infrastructure already started web-based services. However, small budget museums have not been able to develop digital data and programs to communicate and market its content to the public. The discrepancy in digital literacy and infrastructure between the museums may further distance the quality of museum operations and services for less privileged museums to the public. On the brighter side of long-term impacts of this crisis is that it will expand the scope of museum experience for visitors, and it can be an opportunity for museums to attract non-conventional audiences and partners in global scale 24/7. While we are waiting to reopen our physical facilities and spaces to the public and coping with the financial uncertainty, museums can re-examine its mission and current operating norms and skills to be ready for this huge paradigm shift on museum functions and management. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for bringing and sharing with us the results of the survey, which is most interesting. Well, I think now in this session we had quite a broad and good panorama and covered quite a number of issues, so we're starting to understand a bit better what's happening with the museum sector and the sectors around it. So shall we maybe move into the second question and see, we already started to touch upon this and see what kind of innovations are being put in place. What will the rules of the game change, or are there any game changes that we'll want to bring into the future? So for this, maybe I would go back to Joan. Would you like to share with us your perspective on this?
Well, I think that if museums are now really innovating under the crisis, it's because they were already an innovative sector. Nothing begins like that from zero. We are innovating because the innovative process were already at stake. ICOM proposed a new definition of museums in Kyoto, which was postponed. Well, I think that now we need it urgently. We need a new generation of museums that combine cultural innovation and social cohesion, on the one hand, with local economic development on the other hand. The conception of museums as public institutions of knowledge, inherited from the Enlightenment, must be recovered. And the digital revolution can help, but it will be dead if it's only technological. And here I would like to stress 5 ideas to make it more transformative. First one, digital revolution, okay, but it should be a narrative revolution. We need comprehensive narratives to place objects, buildings, and landscapes. But to really improve narratives, we need to recover museums as research nodes in different fields, as it has been already said. Second, heritage revolution. Virtual museums, even with the best digital resources, do not eliminate the need for collections or face-to-face public activities. Look, without objects and documents, a museum would be like a currency without the endorsement of gold or wealth. So, a fake museum. Third, organizational revolution. If these days of telecommuting are transforming museums, that is because suddenly their internal organization and their links with institutions have become more flexible. And that's the case also with their global intercity contexts, which have been strengthened. So now there is a flexible moment to go and push new things. Fourth, citizen revolution. That's very important for me. Museums can be crucial for cultural democracy in the near future, mobilizing knowledge and heritage in a digital context. How? Bringing culture and education together and reaching much more easily young people and socially deprived sectors. It's an opportunity. And fifth, tourism revolution. Yes, I think we should go to a tourism revolution. If we succeed in museums in articulating new points of view via the web and other digital means, museums can help really to diversify objectives and to prescribe best practices for visitors. For example, in city museums, by the way, in CAMOC, in City East and other networks, we are now talking about the right to the city through different ways of visiting. Citizens are, after all, people in traveling. We are citizens always. So that's what we should do and innovate, but for that we need money. And here, just a question. Paper access, that's a question now which is being discussed, perhaps in the large museums. But in most museums, it can challenge social accessibility for little money. So I think that the way out of the crisis will not come from simple formulas, but that's next question.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, indeed, no simple recipes or formulas. And thank you so much for stressing these different dimensions and the flexibility, but also this increased link between, well, as you say, well, knowledge and heritage, but culture and education. And really, there is a huge potential that is being built now and that should continue in the future. Can I now maybe turn to Nathalie, back to Montreal? What's your perspective on these issues in terms of innovations and game changers and what's happening?
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. I agree with Joan. It's true that now what we're looking new values. New values are emerging in our sector. And in fact, we cannot consider the museum and the publics and our crowds in the same way as it was before. Obviously, the IT is becoming very, very important, and we can see that there is many values which are supported by the OECD and ICOM guide we launched 2 years ago, thanks to this crisis. This is a good aspect of this crisis. For example, we are enhancing the fact that museums are very important for well-being and health, and especially mental health. And it's exactly something we can do right now through our programming, and especially thanks to our platform, digital platform. Also, we are seeing some our IT becoming archives, not just a promotional platform, but also archives. For example, there are many curators who are talking about their collection. There are many artists who talks about their works. There are even some grants given to artists in order them to create some documentation of this crisis, this moment. And third, I would say education. Education because, for example, we have a very important educative platform called EduCart. And now, because so many parents need to learn to their children at home, this platform has been chosen by our Minister of Education. Donc, it is now a learning resources on the official website. We also partner with many school boards, thanks to this platform. So we see that there is many new aspects which will help us to show our role and to enhance our mission in a more social way. We do not think that blockbusters programming and will be as relevant after this crisis. And this is why it's also because we'll have to deal with new sanitary rules in our institutions. And in fact, I would be very happy to know more about the Korea example. We are learning about those new sanitary rules. We will have less people in our galleries, but maybe we will insist on the quality much more than about the quantity. And I think that's exactly in the way we were discussing in Kyoto about the new definition. I'm a great supporter for including two words in the official definition, inclusion and well-being. And I think that there is a wonderful opportunity with this crisis to take this this profile and to reinforce our place in the recovery of our societies and cities. This is
yes, excellent. Thank you so much, Nathalie. And I just want to remind also our participants that your museum was one of the real champions in the field of culture and well-being and mental health. And well, as probably many of you know, doctors in Quebec can prescribe museum visits, which are reimbursed as well. So that's a really true recognition of the impact cultural participation can have on our well-being and our health. Which is becoming quite obvious today, but maybe was less obvious before this crisis. I very much liked your point on this enhanced mission and or as you were saying, enhance the mission of museums in a more social way. So maybe the era of blockbusters is over soon. So it's maybe less with more quality, etc. So that's a really very interesting point. And if that's the trend, that will be very interesting to observe. I see that maybe Mathieu wanted to react to your comments. Maybe we hear to Mathieu and then we move to John.
No, just very quickly, Caterina, I just wanted to complement what John and Nathalie said and say that, I mean, this is a turning point in our industry, I think, unfortunately, to some extent. I think we have to take advantage of it. So this is the time ahead. It will have to be used to rethink the way we manage the museums and also the way we deliver the services to the public. And I think there is an issue which might be further strengthened, and that is basically the investing on the professionals, on the profiles of the people working in the museums. And I think this can be done, especially if you strengthen the links between the museums themselves and the world of the universities, for instance. Of course, we cannot apply the same rule everywhere in the world. There are already more advanced situations, but there are definitely many areas in which right now there's only an academic link, whereas I think we should strengthen the operational link, and therefore the opportunity for students, graduates and postgraduates in offering them the opportunity to enter directly the museum career. That's I think, as I said, this is a turning point. So all these issues will have to be addressed. Definitely ICOM is the platform and the arena where to discuss it. And the very last point, it's about the flexibility which will be further required by the public, by our visitors. Already in the recent years, all of us, we experienced a big change in terms of audience requests, audience need. And we all know that museums are no longer just, premises to visit the permanent collections or the exhibitions, but became more and more places where people meet, interact, experience different ways of culture. And to this extent, I think we should work on that even further. And even here, there are more advanced experiences, but I think the overall, what we would need is maybe to set up a sort of a common ground, a minimum common ground for all museums, so that you can deliver quality services and quality culture of high level as from this ground upwards.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mathieu. And you bring this new dimension about the importance of investing in skills of museum professionals and this need to build an operational link with universities. So that's a very valid point. I think, Nathalie, you also sent a sign when you were speaking to Inkyung, as you were saying, you would be interested in learning more from the Korean experience of getting out of the lockdown and to see how that works. But maybe let's hear first from John, and then we give a bit of time to Inkyung to think about her answer to this question. John Davis, could you maybe share with us your perspective?
Thanks, Ekaterina, and I also endorse many of the themes that the previous speakers have raised. I think one interesting way into the digital question is to look at the level of digital participation in museums before the crisis. And in the UK, we have some evidence for this. So in England, around half the population adult population visit museums in a given year. And of those, around 60% will visit the website to book tickets or check out exhibitions that they're interested in. But if we look at the extent to which people were checking out digital collections, that's much lower. It's around 16% of the people visited. Or if it's a digital tour, it's lower still, it's about 11%. Now, obviously, not all museums have an online tour, say, or a full digital collection. But I think the gap between the level of participation, physical participation before, and the digital participation with the collection and with the tours shows that there is a sense of opportunity now. There's more attention on museums' digital offer to kind of build the audience in that space and highlight some of the good work that's been going on for some time in that area. In terms of another way, the key part of museums' digital presence is social media. And so the organization that I work for, Nesta, has done a survey of cultural institutions' use of digital. And one of the things that came back from it, and this won't surprise people, is that almost all cultural institutions, and that will include museums these days, have a Facebook account, a Twitter account. But what those accounts are used for can vary quite a lot. So a reasonable number of institutions will be, I'd say, uploading films to social media. But if you look at stuff that might be particularly relevant for the current crisis, at least when we did the survey a year or so ago, the extent to which organizations, I think it was about 11%, were streaming pure digital events on social media is much lower. And that is in a sense an opportunity, because there isn't that much activity the sector's been doing, at least I'm speaking from the perspective of the UK so far. But obviously, perhaps some skill development training is needed to encourage growth in that area. And the third point I'd like to make, and I guess this is something that was happening before, but perhaps gets more attention now in the current difficult situation, and that is that on social media, on Twitter, you have museum professionals, curators, museum staff sharing and talking about aspects of museums that they care passionately about. And that was going on before the current difficult situation, but I think that's a very positive development and provides a new kind of way for museums to engage with their audience, or at least to engage with them to greater effect in that area. Because I think obviously if one's very used to dealing with museums and very familiar with them, then it becomes more second nature. But if for people who are less familiar or didn't necessarily go to them as kids, having people talking passionately about things they care a lot about in this difficult situation, I think that's a very positive development, and one that may allow museums to engage a wider audience in future. Yeah, those were 3 points I wanted to raise.
Thank you so much, John, for these 3 points. I wanted now to maybe briefly go back to Inkyung, if you would like to share with us your reflection on how the social distancing measures will impact on the number of visitors and the way museums will organize them visits in the near future. What's your take on this?
Let's see, digital. Can you hear me? Yes, digital literacy and infrastructure will provide open the new opportunity and potentials, but we have to understand the digital exhibition is different from the physical exhibition, because traditionally people think that we take pictures and videos and they put it on a website, and that's digital exhibition, but it's not, because digital museum experience will be totally different. I cannot say that I know the digital museum experience is, how is it different from the traditional museum experience, but there's a huge potential, and also huge potential marketing opportunities, which has not been explored in great depth. And also the only difficult challenge is that we need to train ourselves, because our education background is not equipped with a digital literacy. So it's a whole new paradigm shift, and we have to really change our thinking. Otherwise, even though there's a fancy programs and apps that we can use, but how can we get into the visitor's mind that we can deliver the contents so they can be creative and rebuild the culture and exchange. There's a whole new level of skills that we need to explore and learn, and it's very important not just to have the fancy computer or fancy cell phones, that it's not digital literacy, that we have to educate existing staff members. And also it's very important that we have to work with, as previously mentioned, that it's important that we work with unconventional partners worldwide now. It's available now. So the museum profession will be redefined, because traditionally that is academic background is needed to work at museums, but there's a new, totally new sets of skills needed to communicate. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And once again, you highlight and then underline this skills dimension and well, the fact that in fact the borders, the frontiers between sectors are now being blurred, and all these crossovers and contaminations will be happening at much quicker pace in the future. And maybe that's also, this will be the real source of innovation. Before we move into the next round of discussions, I think Antonio Lampis was giving a sign that he wanted also to share with us his views on some of these questions. Antonio, please.
Okay, thank you. So I really agree with Joan and Matthias say. I think this is the time of alliances. So I think that the museum was that cultural institution within the recent year really was able to adapt to the changes in the changes of the contemporary society. But now, also we need alliance with not only with the university. I can explain what's happening in Italy. We ask each university to adopt a museum. But now we need alliance with televisions. We need alliance with new system of payment like contactless, like system to control the quota, the people that can enter in the museum in this time. And we need alliance with theater, with screenwriters, with writing experts to collect better story, to know how to create new stories, because also the vision is so if I can share a screen, is possible? No, okay. So the vision is that the museum will be more sustainable in the next month and the next years. If you be a sort of Netflix, where you can go to see and listen some new story that are full of connection with the experience of the life of the visitors, this of the listener. This is the new challenge of the museum. But the museums was that cultural institution that was really able to change in the last year. So we have, I think in Italy, a leading role to move to the attention to the things, to persons, and this emphasize to effective knowledge and experience is a capital now, is a big capital that we can use to resolve this challenge. We had a 3 years plan of digital environments for the museum, and now is working. So we put 10,000 of vigilance in smart working, and they are in this moment in telelearning, because for many years they don't have occasion to develop their learning and the professional better learning, and now is the moment. So I think that this idea to convert temporarily or not temporarily the museums, because we know that the crises, they are recurrent. They are not just now the COVID. We experience terrorism or recurrent crisis, and this moment is very good to use what the museum have in our revolution, and I think in the coming years we will see this new alliance, and the museum there was a protagonist of the cultural environment, as Joan says.
Very good. Thank you so much, Antonio. Now I think we can move into the last session of our webinar, which is about the policy support measures that cities, regions, national governments, supranational authorities can put in place to address all these different challenges that museums and their communities and their ecosystems are facing today. So here I maybe give the floor back to Antonio, who is, well, once again, Director of Museums in the Italian Ministry of Culture and Tourism. What's your perspective on the supports that a national authority can provide for the museum community? Can you maybe say a few words about what's being done in Italy and what can still be done in the future?
So, the COVID damages are, the museum was in Italy, there was since the 8th of March closed, and I can speak for the state's owned museum. There are 400, more or less, over the 5,000 Italian museum. There are, for the state-owned museum, there's a damage of 20 million every month. And in this moment, so the rebalancing is, we're waiting for a solution of a new government bill, because we say, we hear that the European Commission was able to refund the state of the many damage, and so I can imagine I can't imagine other solution in this moment, because even closed the museum, the products they have a cost, fixed cost, and this is for Italy is already important for identity and to be in the top of the cultural ambiente to save the museums.
Yes, thank you very much, Antonio. Maybe, as you mentioned, the Commission, can I now turn to Maciej? Would you like to say a few words about the measures being discussed or maybe already decided upon by the Commission?
Thank you, Katerina, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's listening to us. Indeed, I wanted to tell you a few words from this supranational perspective, but also linking more broadly to how, during these difficult times, we can look at supporting broadly understood cultural ecosystem. So, of course, if you look at the European Union, the culture is, in fact, the local and national competence according to European Union treaties, which means that, of course, European Union cannot impose anything on EU member states, but at the same time, European Union can assist and help. And there is, of course, a growing pressure and expectation that EU can act and should act in relation to culture and creative sectors. This is an expectation coming very much also from pan-European networks, different thematic networks that we as the European Commission finance through Creative Europe program. Such a recent example here, NEMO, Network of European Museum Organizations, which issued this week a report looking at more than 600 museums from 41 European countries through a survey. And there are, of course, voices coming from different European networks, not only the museums-related ones, but also cultural heritage, architecture, performing arts, just to name a few. And I think this is crucial at this very, very important moment to look, on the one hand, at what these networks are telling us when we look at assessing the damage, but many of them also propose very specific solutions. I think this is something for us to reflect upon. Another very timely point, only 2 days ago, EU Commissioner for Education, Youth, Sport and Culture as well as research and innovation, Mrs. Maria Gabriel, met together with EU culture ministers, 27 EU culture ministers, via video conference to discuss together what can be done. And of course, member states were presenting their different actions put in place, also including specific actions for museums. But the general message, I would say, from that meeting was that there is very strong willingness to cooperate, to exchange information, and to reflect together on different global and potential European solutions. So of course, what's going to happen now is a very much enforced exchange of information, on the one hand between member states, between culture ministries and different ministries, to show what it's being put in place, but also looking for ways to allow these networks and different actors to express themselves and also share their concerns during these difficult times. And this is also, since we're speaking in this global context here, important to know that UNESCO is also planning to have a virtual meeting of culture ministers. This is planned for 22nd of April this month. So I think this is going to be very important also to look at what's going to be discussed there. When speaking about very specific EU measures, I would also divide them in specific categories. So first of all, this kind of, I would say, very universal measures. So you might have heard in recent weeks about different European Union initiatives looking at how structural funds money can be used, or how European Union can propose extra money to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency situation, or finally how state aid measures can be used with more flexible rules allowed by the European Union. These tools are, of course, for different sectors, not only culture and creative sectors specifically. They are very broad, but it is very important at this moment to also look at, because this is very much the discretion of member states and the national level to decide whether they want to use these tools for culture and creative sectors. So this is also very much important role of the sector and these different advocacy organizations and networks to try and advocate to make sure that these different big political tools that are available are also used for the benefit of culture and creative sectors, cultural heritage, or museums. When looking specifically at culture-related tools, what we are doing currently with our Creative Europe program is, of course, looking for as much flexibility as possible. So on the one hand, of course, the ongoing calls, we have decided to extend all the deadlines. The closed calls for cultural cooperation projects, we're going to evaluate them as fast as possible to let the organizations know whether they will be getting the funding. And of course, looking at upcoming calls, we're trying to adjust them slightly to the needs of the current situation. Then, of course, very importantly, any kind of public-private instruments that can be used. We have this culture and creative sectors guarantee facility under Creative Europe program. This is an instrument for financial institutions. So with use of the public money, financial institutions that participate in this scheme can give preferential loans to culture and creative sectors. Of course, we're going to look at this tool very differently now, taking into consideration the current situation. But then what I would like to stress is that long-term planning is equally, if not more important in this context. Since the previous speakers mentioned that we might be looking into a situation that is going to last for months to come, we have to look at what's going to happen next. And in the EU, we are in the process now of negotiating the future budget of the European Union. The European Union budgets are always decided for a period of 7 years each time, and we're currently negotiating the budget from 2021 to 2027. And this is very important in this challenging situation to make sure that budgets for culture are appropriate, that there is enough money for culture and creative sectors, not only in programs such as Creative Europe, which specifically addresses culture and creative sectors, but also other tools of local and regional development, on research, support to SMEs, any kind of public-private instruments. This is very important to defend ambitious budget for culture in the future. So I hope this is going to be the case. And then, of course, last but not least, this policy collaboration that we have between the European Union and member states. We have a number of topics we were going to work on either way, and they, of course, relate to many specific issues that other speakers mentioned, the question of culture and well-being, the question of use of new technologies for museums, or question of knowing who your digital audiences are, looking at ways to linking education and culture, or last but not least, looking at the overall resilience of culture institutions, of artists, and looking at working conditions of artists. This is going to be very important, and we will have to find a good way to also rephrase this planned political collaboration to address the current challenges. And here again, last but not least, I would like to mention the upcoming collaboration the European Commission is going to have with OECD on maximizing the impact of culture on the local development. This is something where we will have to also reflect very much the current challenging situation, and we're of course very much looking forward to work with OECD on this important topic, to also ask ourselves how cities, regions, local authorities can best address the challenges of culture and creative sectors.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure that for all our European participants, the messages that you were just sharing with us are very important. And we have some 700 people from Europe who are attending our webinar right now. So thank you so much, Maciej. And of course, as you said, it will be very interesting and maybe, well, challenging as well to work now on our joint project with the cities and regions in Europe, given the context, but maybe even more important, probably, to join forces between the OECD and the European Commission to assist our cities and regions to really help and capitalize on the potential of creative sectors. If I can now turn maybe to Joan, what's your perspective? What are the policy supports that are being put in place, are needed by cities, regions, countries?
Well, I think that first of all, we should stress again that the museum ecosystem needs to be strengthened. After decades of outsourcing under very precarious conditions many times, I think that we really must think in a very creative system which needs a new cultural Keynesianism. We need a new cultural Keynesianism. We talk about Keynesianism in many fields, but museums must have their place, their specific place in a new paradigm, as Inky said, agreed between many agents, between multiple agents. I would like to score 5. First, icon. I think that the museums inherited from 19th and 20th century are not anymore the museums for the 21st century. The debate on the definition of museums, as I mentioned before, should be resumed as soon as possible. We really need the new definition to consolidate an innovative and participative atmosphere, including the keyword for a new enlightened museums era, knowledge. We have been talking a lot about knowledge, all of us in different ways. So I think that really ICOM is crucial for that. And second, OECD. I think that really the debate in which local society can be enhanced by museums, both as part of the cultural frame for social cohesiveness and as part of more sustainable tourism, is crucial too. The local development through museums is a topic that we should push forward, as OCDE has been doing. And now it's much more important than before. Third, governments, different levels of governments. That's what I said about Keynesian policies at different levels. And with a specific consideration of the museum sector. The museum sector has its own specificity and it's often forgotten. In the European Union, something that would be very important is to adapt the system of contracting and public tenders to the exceptionality of culture in general and to the museum sector in particular. That's very important. The system of contracting and public tenders does not adapt to museum sector, which is a very fragile ecosystem of many, many small pieces, some big pieces, but some very small pieces. And so I think we should go forward in the debate that culture is, after all, something different. Then fourth, cities. Really, cities must be a key in the new era. Museums must be considered as ordinary facilities. We have always considered museums as something extraordinary. There is a museum. No, museums should be considered as ordinary facilities wholly embedded in city life and city existence. And that would be the best way for an alternative approach to culture and to tourism at the same time. Because through cities, we can enhance both social cohesiveness and sustainable tourism if we try to find this new paradigm of local development. And finally, museums themselves. No one will pay attention to the museum sector as a whole if the museums themselves do not rethink their mission statement, their internal organization, and their financial mechanisms. Antonio talked before about universities adopting museums. I think that we could be even more ambitious. At least we tried in our museum to adopt universities. Museums are really a high point of culture shared by citizens, by different professions, and this place of knowledge should also be in direct contact with universities. Museums are the place where universities can share their knowledge with everybody, and museums themselves can also create new knowledge in that situation. And well, I think that after all, we have a lot of work to do, but from my experience these days with the MUHBA team in Barcelona, MUHBA is the Barcelona History Museum, it's a municipal museum, I would say that confinement sharpens the imagination and that it's a good moment to think about the future. And that's it.
Well, thank you so much also for this message of hope and inspiration to all of us. Before maybe I move to Natalie, I was thinking that for the moment we haven't heard much about other actors. Of course, we focus a lot on the local administrations, on regional, on national governments, ministries. But what about other players? What about the private sector? Because we also see that quite a number of private foundations who were really the supporters of arts and culture for decades now shift some of their resources to the real urgency to support the health sectors. And also they can see a huge decrease in individual donations. So this can also impact somehow on the museums, and we maybe can also reflect a little bit what kind of measures and incentives could there be to support this cooperation between the private sector and the museums and cities as well. So maybe, well, if you have ideas on that, it would be good to hear that. But first of all, I would like also to turn to Natalie to hear your view on what kind of supports, innovative supports are needed in the current context.
Thank you again. We can see a different kind of support right now, and what is the most important is the spirit of constructive solidarity. We are animated by no more by competition, but more by co-creation or co-evolution. We understand that we all belong to the same ecosystem. So what we can see here in Canada is first, we have a special public policy coming from the federal government, which just help each institutions to keep their employees because they want to avoid a huge shutdown. We also can see other strategy, for example, the Canada Council for the Arts or the Montreal Council for the Arts, who hurry the attribution for grants, and especially for artists, institutions, etc., because they desperately need some cash. We also see, and this is more from the government of Quebec, the provincial government, they want us to rebuild our society. Their position is, how can we not just save museums, but how could you help us to save the society? So they will be very, very cautious about how can we develop, how can we think new strategies in order that we can collaborate with a broader part of our society, talking about tourism, schools, inclusion, etc. And of course, there are the private philanthropy. This is a very interesting strategy I'm working on right now with some colleagues in Canada, because we see that some private foundations are eager to keep alive their institution and their museum, but they will decide to give an exceptional attribution to museum, in condition that the employees and the unions will also accept to reduce their time. And so they will work 3 or 4 days every week, etc. So you can see this negotiation between the private sector and the union sector in order to keep the institution alive. So all those strategies of solidarity are very inspirational, I think. And I just want to end with this quote made by the UNESCO a few days ago, that when we are isolated, culture helps us to stay together. Culture is really what unifies all of us. And it's true that culture is a kind of essential services. And it is exactly what I can hear thanks to governments, private donors, private foundations, and other public policies.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That's really great to have this broader perspective out of Europe and other realities. I think we are really nearing, well, we almost exhausted our time. But before we start to wrap up, I wanted to take a very quick comment from Mattia, and maybe Inkyung, if you have also anything to share with us. And then Peter, there were a lot of things that were referring to ICOM, to the definition of museum, so maybe you could also share with us your concluding thoughts on this overall discussion. And then I will invite my colleague, Professor Pierluigi Sacco, who is a senior advisor at the OECD and the head of the Venice Office on Culture and Local Development, maybe to provide his final thoughts and a sort of a wrap up of key messages that we want to keep in our memory out of this 1 hour and a half of discussion. So, Mattia?
Yes, thank you. No, very, very quickly. I think we need, before ending this webinar, I think it's important to stress once again the fact that in the short and medium term, what museums need are covering of operational costs rather than, let's say, ad hoc project related costs, which I would rather leave it for the long term. I think all the reflections we made today, which will be collected, are extremely useful, and we cannot miss them at all. Nevertheless, on the short term, if we want these institutions to be alive in 12 months' time, we need to launch this kind of message to all those in the position to finance the cultural sector, namely the museum industry. So please do not forget the operational costs, because only by financing the operational costs, you will allow not just the private, but also the public institutions to be open in the months to come. And so to start let's say, reopening their doors to the visitors, okay? That's the simple and the last comment I wanted to stress here. Thank you, Caterina.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, important things first. Inkyung, would you have any final thoughts you would like to share with us?
Thank you. First, I'd like to emphasize that I agree more with Joan's comments, and we have to work within from ourselves to redefine our role, and then operational paradigm shift. And also, I like to suggest that maybe OECD and ICOM together, that we can prepare a comprehensive and economic and social impact analysis of this pandemic crisis on museums, maybe a year from now or something. So we can have very concrete understanding, and also maybe we'll find something and then we can work from that, how we can prepare better, or we can steer our attention to different ways of working method and so forth. So I strongly suggest that OECD and ICON work again together and after the guidelines. So it's another project that I suggest. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Peter, would you like to share with us your final words?
Well, I would take a question I received in the meantime, what society needs that museums can provide, because I think it can wrap up, resume what has been said that museums play a role in local and sustainable development. You spoke about the OECD guide. That museums play a very important role in education. Maybe we didn't speak enough about that, but it's a very important role in, for example, in African countries. Museums contribute to identity, be it national or regional or even generational, through activities for certain visitor groups, through the experience they offer. They can strengthen the social cohesion and the resilience of communities. I think this will be very important now when communities deal with the trauma of the pandemic. If I think of Northern Italy, I think there it's extremely important that museums start to collect now rapidly and react to, try to do research, to offer programs dealing with this trauma. Those museums, and I think Natalie Bondio spoke about it, contribute to well-being and health. Again, for certain groups, I'm thinking of programs for people with dementia, for example. And they do this, and I think there we come to the point of the definition Joan and others made as a museum as an open space for social interaction as meeting places, which are really open and inclusive, and thus can play these very different roles, or very important roles we heard about.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. Pierluigi, you were in the listening mode throughout this discussion. Can you share with us your thoughts and your takeaways from this talk?
Thank you, Katia. Well, I think it's been an extraordinary rich discussion, and it really had so many interesting stimuli. And I don't even try to summarize what has been said, because really so many things were covered. But if I can simply find a red thread through some of the interventions, I think that one of the most probably provocative ways, but also stimulating ways to look at the situation we're in at the moment is in terms of a gigantic natural experiment. Imagine if, let's say, a few months ago, we were told, imagine a moment in which all the cultural institutions are shut down at the same moment, what do you do? Sounded like science fiction, and now this is our reality. And it's an experiment because we clearly have a before and an after. So as it happens in all these circumstances, when you have a clear before and an after, it's all about change of attitudes. So how do we react in terms of the new scenario, and what kind of change of attitudes are strategically needed? I think that some very interesting ideas emerged from the discussion. First of all, what is clear is that that's a unique, probably once in a lifetime opportunity in trying to constructively restructure the relationship between museums, economy, and society. Because what has happened today, clearly, is that museum, as it was said, I mean, the level of traffic, of digital access to museums has been so dramatically increased that now it's clear that people have a very natural way to acknowledge how this possibility to access, for example, museums from a digital mode has contributed to maintaining people psychological well-being and even mental health. Because clearly we live in an extremely stressful psychological situation. And the level of comfort that not only museums, but more generally, of course, all kinds of cultural contents and experiences have given is before the eyes of everybody. So this kind of restructuring is extremely important. How? Well, one point that, for example, was raised in several moments is that we are basically restructuring the experience of the museum itself. You know, one of the big problems is that we know that there are large parts of social constituencies that don't feel at home in museums, they feel they do not belong. But having the possibility to access digitally means that that sense of, let's say, reverence, or that kind of church-like experience that for somebody is so intimidating, when you have a digital access possibilities change completely. So this means that the experience is being redefined, not just because, I mean, the previous kind of experience has been outdated, not at all, but clearly there are now new layers being added, and these new layers can create a new familiarity for many constituencies toward the museum. This is an opportunity not to be wasted. The second point that was raised, and I totally agree, is change of attitude in terms of cultural professionals. Are we prepared to the change? And to a large extent, we're not. It's been clear, of course, we need to support financially and professionally in all ways possible our cultural professionals today. But what is also needed is a huge capability building adaptation here, because clearly things will not be like before, and the kind of skills, the kind of attitudes that are needed from cultural professionals now are profoundly different. And sometimes in museums, the museum sector has, of course, some shining beacons of innovation, but overall, the environment, the museum environment has been relatively slow to adapt to these new challenges before the crisis. So even more now, it's extremely important that we have a push in this direction. And I really look forward to reading the NEMO report that was mentioned by Masei, that clearly can give us some interesting insights also in how the most dynamic and innovative parts of the museum environment are trying to react to the crisis. The other aspect is, of course, change in attitudes in terms of engagement. How do we engage in the new situation people? Because clearly the role of museums now is changing. When you have a physical museum, you can be a physical hub, and this of course makes, I mean, it can be intimidating to somebody, but extremely stimulating and attractive for somebody else. So how can we maintain this role of a social and knowledge hub in the new situation? This is a big challenge. I think we had some interesting ideas in this regard. And then, of course, there is the problem of the government, because our governments on all levels understanding what is the new scenario? Are they really understanding what is at stake here? I think the Joan idea of a cultural Keynesianism, for example, is an interesting idea. And it's an idea that, of course, relates to the fact that we have to spend a lot in a moment like this to support the economy. Why not targeting some kind of spending here in terms of developing new knowledge assets that enable people to participate more actively in this new game and really create value through different sources? And this leads us to the last point, which is social impact. Clearly, what is happening is that in the new scenario, the role of museums and more generally of cultural institutions will be a lot about social impact. Natalie, of course, spoke about the role that the Montreal Museum has been performing in the last few years in terms of, for example, creating a new ecosystem and a dialogue, an extremely innovative dialogue between culture and health. But this is just an example, and an example that, by the way, nicely frames into the new European Agenda for Culture that has been published in 2018 by the European Commission, that provides us with a very interesting blueprint for imagining a massive role of museums and cultural institutions as cultural impact, social impact platforms. But from this point of view, it's very much about concrete experimentation. So it's very important to think of the support, but it's also very important to think of the proactive reaction of cultural institutions, not simply to be, let's say, an endangered species to be supported, but really as a new engine of social change in a situation in which we will all need new solutions, and culture can really have a key role in preserving the social cohesion of our fabric today.
Thank you so much, Pierluigi, for opening even broader perspectives to this discussion. Well, I think we have done well. It was really an excellent discussion. We've been followed by almost 1,400 people. Broadly, half of them were from Europe and the other half from Americas and Asia. So that's, I mean, quite an interesting, I hope we were delivering interesting messages to our audience. And I think, Peter, you would join me in thanking all of our speakers who found the time, despite the different time zones, to join this discussion and share with us their perspectives. So thank you once again to all our speakers. And I would also like to, yeah, bravo. And I would also like to thank OECD partners who support this work on culture and local development. And this is Fondazione di Venezia, the Foundation of Venice, who hosts our office in Venice, and also the Veneto Region Chambers of Commerce, Union Camere delle Regioni Veneto. Please note that this was our first talk this month on these issues. The next one will be in 1 week's time, next Friday, and where we will look into other cultural and creative sectors. And also please join our Digital Academy on Cultural and Creative Industries that will be happening at the end of the month. And that is organized with our partners, the Autonomous Province of Trento, the Autonomous Province of Bolzano, and specifically also the Trento School of Management. So we hope to see you soon in 1 week's time or at the end of the month at the Academy. And thank you once again for joining this talk from wherever you are. Stay safe.